my father had mentioned that his specialty is in biblical studies, and mine as well. And for those of you who have been to seminars or have been in my classes, I'm not saying anything controversial. I like biblical texts. That's been my the bulk of my training has been in learning how to interpret and to handle biblical texts. That's not all that I've done. I spent a goodly part of my early education in philosophy, and so I'll put that on the shelf for a minute. This actually is going to be the 10-year anniversary of our confirmation in the church, my wife and I, back in 2000. Oh, thank you. After 32 years of Protestant back in 2010, we entered as quietly as we could RCIA, but as these things go, word gets out. And I had already been teaching in biblical studies in a non-Catholic context up to that point. And I found myself, largely on social media, but also in person, in the midst of conversations and exchanges that were that tended toward the acidic. And I, at that time, realized the value in my philosophical education, even quite apart from biblical studies proper, where a careful discipline with respect to the interior life was hand in hand with a particular skill set in being able to analyze statements and arguments, how to tell the difference, for example, between an argument and a quarrel, or an argument that's proposed to be an argument but actually isn't. And so I had to sort of refine the chops. My training in philosophy in 2010 had been about 12 years prior even to that. So sort of digging out the old books and refamiliarizing myself. So as we sat around talking about how to craft this seminar, Dad and Josh thought, you ought to do, you're the guy who studied logic here, you ought to do in the third session a kind of hands-on how to approach to some of the theoretical things that we'll be discussing in sessions 1 and 2. So this is going to be a very different kind of presentation today. That's the preamble to say that. This will read very differently. The content's very different from what you've probably heard from me before anyway. I hope, though, it will be very helpful. We're going to look at the interior life. In fact, I've structured the talk to follow here in sort of two parts. The first part is more of an analysis of the interior life, what's required in us to be productive participants in disagreements and communications. And then the second part is really kind of a how-to, putting the rubber to the road, and some things to do, some things to avoid. And I hope that there will be questions, and we can talk more about them in the break. Real quickly on that, I hope I can get done by around noon, and I think that lunch is going to be catered right around that time. Our hope is that we'll go grab lunch, and almost as though we were getting back into a fourth session, for those of you who are able to linger, please do, and have your questions at the ready, and we'll try to have a time of exchanging ideas ourselves. And with that, let me take a sip of water, see if I've forgotten anything here. I think that's about it. Let's begin with the occasion for my title, Gracious and Seasoned with Salt, Speaking Christianly, or How to Argue Without Quarreling. The statement comes from St. Paul's words, his exhortation, his strong urging in Colossians 4:6, to let our speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. There's a larger background to Paul's exhortation, and it's the extraordinary reality with which he and all the apostles have been preoccupied, of this new heavenly kingdom that Jesus has brought into the world, described helpfully, I think, by actually a non-Catholic theologian. I think you'll find familiar ideas here, Stanley Hauerwas. Jesus gathers people around his law so that a society comes into being like no society the world has ever seen. It was a society which, counter to all precedent, was mixed in its composition. It was mixed racially with both Jews and Gentiles, mixed religiously with fanatical keepers of the law and advocates of liberty from all forms, with both radical monotheists and others just in the process of disentangling their minds from idolatry, mixed economically with members both rich and poor. When he called his society together, Jesus gave its members a new way of life to live. He gave them a new way to deal with offenders by forgiving them. He gave them a new way to deal with violence by suffering. He gave them a new way to deal with money by sharing it. He gave them a new way to deal with a corrupt society by building a new order, not smashing the old. He gave them a new pattern of relationship between men and women, between parent and child, between master and slave, in which was made concrete a radical new vision of what it means to be a human person. He gave them a new attitude toward the state and toward the enemy nation. And this new way, let me just elaborate a little, of Jesus' kingdom also pertains to a new way of communicating with those who are outside of the kingdom, not just with those who are inside. And that's the immediate background, actually, of what St. Paul is exhorting in Colossians 4:6, where in verse 5, the previous verse, we read, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time." So in the logic of verses 4 and 5 in Colossians 4, the saints make the best use of their time by learning habits of communication that are not merely polite, but also productive in drawing out the truth in the course of a conversation, like salt draws out the flavor in the course of a meal. They're to pursue this training for the sake of outsiders, those who are not already confirmed within the covenant community of the faithful. Behind St. Paul's exhortation, so, is a fundamentally missional or evangelistic motivation. And there is a specific scenario also that Paul foresees in front of his exhortation. So he's got a motivation pushing it forward. Hey, this is evangelistic here. This is why I'm teaching you or telling you to bone up on these things. But I also foresee in front of this, as missional evangelists, the saints are going to find themselves in conversations with outsiders in which they're going to need to have developed skills for knowing how to respond. That's the language of verse 6. Knowing how to respond to the various things which outsiders say. So some of our time and attention ought to be taken up with learning how to respond with skill, how to be in conversations with people who do not see things the way we do, who are outside of a covenant community we are in, and knowing how to navigate or to field, to receive their disagreements, what to do in those scenarios. So there's really an urging here on St. Paul's part toward the very practical. You need to learn this stuff. So that's where I'm headed increasingly as we move forward. I want to share an anecdote. In this book, my wife has read it, wants me to read it. I've just begun leafing through it. It's called The Common Rule, Habits of Purpose for an Age of Distraction. Many things, as you know, distract us from, say, taking up Paul's urging and learning a new skill. Justin Whitmell Early, I think is how you pronounce his name, describes in the book a crisis moment for himself. He's an avid reader. He's in his 20s, productive, I think, lawyer, and he was in a bookshop. And the previous year, he had just read a record 30 books. And he was hoping to match it in the present year, and he was standing in the bookshop, and he realized in a moment of crisis that as he stared at the wall in front of him, given what he supposed would be at least 50 more productive years of reading, that wasn't enough time to read even the books on this one wall in the bookshop, which are about 1,500. And he realized simultaneously that every decision he made with respect to his work, conversations he had, and especially with respect to media, steal is too strong a word, but it was a decision that killed off another option, right? So if I choose to spend X amount of minutes on social media or reading some fluff, those are minutes I can't get back, and I'm killing off one of the books or part of the book, or right? He realized also at the same time that, especially with regard to social media or the internet in general, there's a different world and a different mental life that is cultivated and promoted by that than is promoted or cultivated when one reads a book. And the difference is in how social media draws us toward a rapid changing of the subject or a changing of the activity, and is antithetical, it's not very compatible with the slow contemplative life of pondering and staying with a thought or a course for a period of time, right? So over here you have rapid changing of the subject, and here you have staying with the subject. And finally he realized, and this is in the course of a chapter he's developing all this, that this rapid changing of subjects also is a place or an ethos in which certain habits of communicating, although they're there, are too antithetical. So communicating with others is shaped in a radically profound way, in a way that's detrimental to the sort of time and attention that we need in order for our own lives to be shaped in positive ways. So he's seeing 2 or 3 different outcomes of sort of standing before him and putting a choice before him. Which choose this day, with whom you will serve, and to badly bungle a verse. And he uses the word curate. He appeals to this idea of curating, which I have defined for you there in your notes, 1.1. To curate is to select, to organize, and otherwise manage the elements of an exhibit, or of one's life, we might say. It's what a museum manager does in a museum, to curate, to acquire and to position and arrange different pieces of art, such that the person who comes in is presented with potentially a life-changing experience of observation, right? There's a science there. And social media is a place in which many folks, maybe many of us, spend varying amounts of time both curating a version of life with varying degrees of truthfulness and observing the curations of others. Now, I don't mean to talk down. Going for social media, thinking about Paul's urging, is that it puts us in touch with outsiders, creating opportunities for exchanges in which we may carry out the missional vision of Colossians 4, 5, and 6. But going against social media is the character of the exchanges it promotes. A quantity over quality approach inherently promotes reaction, hence the emoji, right? Rather than deliberation. We're not encouraged to say much. Twitter's even worse. Is it still a 140 character limit? Right? So you're prevented, even in the software, from saying much, from participating in meaningful, extended conversations. And because the sort of wisdom in which Paul exhorts the saints to walk is not the sort that many who live in a world shaped by social media have taken the time to learn, the exchanges that we witness, or perhaps in which we participate, are heavily weighted toward unwisdom. So it's not a place in which well-ordered thoughts are promoted or cultivated. It's the quick soundbite, speak unilaterally, and then leave before I can be responded to. And as Justin observes, we are guaranteed to be formed in our consumption unless we ruthlessly pursue curation. That doesn't mean we ought not to participate. I think we have a missional mandate to do so. But I think that we also need at the same time to be availing ourselves to the training that will make our exchanges productive for the kingdom. So it's not run and hide, it's let's figure out how to do this better. In Josh's opening remarks about Kelly Anderson's description of James, I was struck where James, according to Anderson, invites us to make an honest interior search to uncover where we are double-minded. And that's where I think we need to begin. So in the next section here, by way of a meditation on Gorgias. I'm no Plato expert, but he wrote, he transcribed actually, this book, and you're welcome to look at it. I'll leave it up here for later. I'd like to look at an excerpt from it and use this as a jumping off point for performing an examination of our own interior life. That's step one, I think, in learning how to be a productive communicator or a productive participant with those who are outside the kingdom or across from us. Gorgias is a dialogue between four ancient Greek thinkers. It's recorded by Plato, in which the philosopher Socrates, who represents Plato's position, examines the character and claims of the science of oratory. Another word we might use is rhetoric, and attempts to show to his dialogue partners, Gorgias, Pallas, and Callicles, all three of whom are champions of oratory, that the way of the philosopher is preferable to the way of the orator-politician. The essence of the way of the philosopher is reflection, Socrates argues, while the essence of the way of the orator is presentation. And Socrates' position is that it is better to pursue a reflective life than a presentational one. That's because the reflective life has a better claim to being the happy life, what in theological terms would be called the life of blessing, the life God wishes for his creatures to enjoy, than does the life that is ordered by rhetoric or presentation, presenting oneself through one's speech. Notice how Socrates' concerns intersect with the two ways of life held out before us in this global phenomenon of social media. As we consider an excerpt from the dialogue with Gorgias below, we won't have much trouble, I think, coming up with exchanges that we've witnessed, or perhaps in which we've participated, say on Facebook or Twitter or some other social media platform, or even outside of these, in a world that's shaped by them, despite Plato having transcribed the dialogues sometime between 428 and 347. And I want to stay with that last sort of parenthetical remark. Whether or not you're a frequent participant on social media, we are inescapably now in a world that is shaped by it. We are going to be in conversations with people whose lives are shaped by it, or whose friends' lives with whom they've been in conversation have been shaped by it. So it's getting to us, whether we're surrounded, we can't escape. And again, if my remarks earlier were maybe not quite as crisp as I would have liked, the habits and practices that are cultivated in such a world are decreasingly ordered toward the contemplative, and more frequently ordered toward the rapid and the presentational, right? The shoot it out there and then escape. People don't want to change, they just want to tell you what they think and then not be accountable for it. And sometimes that's ourselves too. We might fall into that same trap. So that's where I think this is so relevant to what is happening today, or the life in which we find ourselves. So here's the excerpt. It's a rather lengthy one. I hope you'll bear with me. So this is Socrates speaking. Gorgias, I take it that you, like me, have experienced many discussions, and that you've observed this sort of thing about them. It's not easy for the participants to define jointly what they're undertaking to discuss, and so, having learned from and taught each other to conclude their session. Instead, if they're disputing some point and one maintains that the other isn't right or isn't clear, they get irritated, each thinking the other is speaking out of spite. They become eager to win instead of investigating the subject under discussion. Sound familiar? In fact, in the end, some have a most shameful parting of the ways, abuse heaped upon them, having given and gotten to hear such things that make even the bystanders upset with themselves for having thought it worthwhile to come to listen to such people. How many times does that happen? Why am I reading this thread? Right? They're just heaping abuse. It's stealing my humanity away, I've heard people say. What's my point in saying this? It's that I think you are now saying things that aren't very consistent or compatible with what you were first saying about the matter at hand. So I'm afraid to pursue my examination with you for fear that you should take me to be speaking with eagerness to win against you, rather than to have our subject become clear. For my part, I'd be pleased to continue questioning you if you're the same kind of man I am. Otherwise, I would drop it. And what kind of man am I? One of those, listen carefully, who would be pleased to be refuted if I say something untrue, and who would be pleased to refute anyone who says anything untrue. One who, however, wouldn't be any less pleased to be refuted than to refute. For I count being refuted a greater good, insofar as it is a greater good to be rid of the greatest evil from oneself than to rid someone else of it. In other words, it's better for you to show me that I'm wrong than for me to show you that you are wrong. It's better to be shown the truth. That's the greatest good I myself can experience. I don't suppose that any evil for a man is as great as false belief about the things we're discussing right now. So if you say you're this kind of man, let's continue the discussion. But if you think we should drop it, let's be done with it and break it off. This almost never happens in my limited observation. Although someone with whom I have seen it happen is someone named Brian Cross, whose summary remarks, I think, are beyond reproof. So I'm going to read a couple of his comments here to summarize. What the character of Socrates shows in this excerpt is a crucial aspect of the love of wisdom, in contrast to the love of appearing to win a debate. But not all persons are as noble in character as is Socrates, and love wisdom and truth so much that they do not run away from occasions of being refuted, but truly desire to be refuted when wrong, so as to be rid of falsehood. This is why Socrates at this point in the dialogue has to ask Gorgias which kind of person Gorgias is. However, for those who are like Socrates in their love of wisdom, the willingness of others to refute one's own errors is, all other things being equal, one of the greatest signs of their love, goodwill, and friendship. In his subsequent conversation with Paulus, Socrates argues that one who discovers that he has injustice within his soul should voluntarily go to the local judge as soon as possible to have the injustice removed from his soul through just punishment, the way a sick man would make haste to see a doctor in order to have a sickness removed from his body. This, of course, is directly opposed to the widespread notion that the one who has committed injustice should do everything in his power to avoid being apprehended by the officers of the law and brought before the judge to receive just punishment. We don't want to be caught nor to be held accountable for our injustice. We seek ways to reduce that or mitigate it. We might be inclined, that's the end of Brian's summary. So back to me here. We may be inclined, for example, to visit the defense attorney when we are found to be unjust, rather than the judge, to see if the sentence we are likely to receive from the judge, especially if it is the sort that, though painful, stands to purge us of our injustice, may instead be circumvented and thus avoided beforehand or during the proceedings by the attorney. Hey, attorney, maybe you can help me get a lesser sentence. Even though by rights I deserve X, I'd rather have X minus, right? X minus Y, where it's a lesser sentence. We're allergic to the trauma. So it goes in conversations with others. where we may want for our opinion to be agreed upon and esteemed, when what we need, if our opinion is incorrect, is for it to be shown to be incorrect. In our foolishness, we confuse and equate desire with need, so that we wrongly regard what we want as what is needed and not merely wanted. And we regard what we actually need as unwantable. In my foolishness, I do not want my incorrect opinion to be shown to be incorrect, though if I were wise, I would. Right? Wisdom, on the other hand, over against foolishness, matches need with desire, teaching the heart to desire what in wisdom it realizes it needs, and then actually desiring it, and not merely realizing that one should desire it. Since wisdom, by definition, thanks to my father who explained this earlier, according to Proverbs, or portrayal according to Job, is living with skill and not merely thinking with it. So it's not just a mental state. It's turning the will to truly desire what it is that in wisdom it realizes it should desire. To desire rightly is to move the will wisely. And I'm borrowing from Brian one more time here. The argument here in the Gorgias about running to the judge to remove injustice from our soul also applies to false beliefs in our intellect. Namely, that if we have false beliefs, we should go as soon as possible to those who know whether these beliefs are false and can show us that these beliefs are false. And the more important the belief in question, the greater we should desire to submit that belief to such examination, because of the greater value of knowing the truth about the matter and not remaining ignorant or deceived about it. The difficulty of seeing the falsehood of a belief is greatest for the one who holds that false belief. Hence, those who love themselves rightly and who know about this human blind spot regarding the falsehood of our own false beliefs voluntarily and regularly present their beliefs to the knowledgeable for examination and refutation, the way we present our bodies to the doctor for inspection during our regular checkup, or we present our souls to the priest in confession. So as a whole person, there are some good habits that maybe some of us are already doing, but if you're not, here's a new one. As we see in the Gorgias, we should present ourselves to those who are knowledgeable for training or for retraining sometimes. Hey, this is the opinion or the position I have been holding for a long time. Critique it for me. Tell me where my blind spots might be. This is the kind of community I think that St. Paul has in mind when he's urging the Colossians to make the best use of your time, learning how to respond and to be in these moments of disagreement with outsiders. Picking up with the quote, Socrates shows our dependence on others for rooting out our false beliefs. This dependence on others to help us discover and remove our false beliefs in order thereby to love ourselves and the truth rightly shows the relation between genuine friendship and growth in intellectual virtue. Those persons show themselves to be the truest friends, the most benevolent friends, who gently and when appropriate, privately, with sensitivity to our receptivity and with love-enabled perception of our deep desire for the truth, show us the errors within us we do not see, the more so the greater the error. And conversely, those persons show themselves to be noble-minded, who show themselves to be like Socrates, not only eager to be refuted so as to be rid of falsehood, but actively soliciting refutation, that is the showing of my being wrong, from those who are both benevolent and wise. In doing so, they love themselves and the truth rightly, and live out virtuously, as dependent rational animals, our necessary mutual dependence for growing in the intellectual virtues. So in the same way that I run to the doctor, or maybe I don't run to, maybe none of us runs to the doctor, but I hasten, I recognize it as a good to square things with the doctor if I'm witnessing something in myself that doesn't seem right, Similarly, to the confessional, when I recognize that there's something within me that is not square, so also we should hasten to those with training to avail ourselves. To be that kind of person is at least half the way to being a productive participant in exchanges in which there is a true disagreement with ourselves and an outsider, or an insider for that matter. So that's the sort of the internal examination, the examination of conscience, if you will, that I wanted to begin. And at that moment, or at this point, I guess, we'll move more into praxis. So how does this flesh out practically in terms of the trade skills, if you will, that we need in order to be productive participants in exchanges? And one of the things that we chatted about in the staff meeting where we were hatching this seminar was, hey, let's introduce some new vocabulary. Because oftentimes, well, if you ask Peter Kreeft, how many people know who that is? Right? He wrote a book on logic, actually. And the first task is to define one's terms in that book. Before we even construct arguments, we need to know what the words mean. And similarly, there are some trade terms I think will be helpful for us to know. So that's what I'd like to do right here. And I'll start by differentiating between quarrel and argument. That's in my subtitle. You knew it was going to come, so here we are. A quarrel is a disagreement between two or more people, usually involving an emotion-escalated exchange of opinions in which each person's chief aim may be either to convince the other person to agree, see, not to be refuted. That's not the chief aim, is not to be refuted, but to convince the other person to acquiesce, to agree, or to communicate discontent about the other person's position. A quarrel is something one has with someone else. It is fundamentally shared and cannot be held independently by an individual, such as one holds an opinion. Even when you say, well, I got a quarrel with that person, even if you haven't, I mean, that's still something you have with somebody, right? In the minds of many folks, the word argument refers to what we've just defined as a quarrel, or at least an argument in their minds is thought of as an event of disagreement between two or more people, even if the disagreement is civil, and remains so during the course of any discussion about it. Many folks are unaware that the word argument, in the context of logic and critical thinking, that is the science of thinking carefully and with precision, critical not meaning negative there, but analytically, carefully, refers to something entirely different from quarrel as we've defined it above. In the context of logic and critical thinking, an argument is a series of statements or propositions, one of which, called the conclusion, is given as the necessary result of the combination of the others, called premises. So in this way, arguments are like equations in math. How many people were good at math in high school? I wasn't. I'm glad to see some of you were. So you're going to get this much more quickly than I did, actually. Take heart. They're like equations in math, with the premises being on the left side of the equal sign and the conclusion being on the right. It's a purely objective analysis of the relationship between statements. That's what an argument is. So here's an example, classic one from Philosophy 101 or Logic 101. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. So even if you haven't looked, you should be able to get it, right? The conclusion is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right. In contrast, a couple of notes here. In contrast to a quarrel, an argument does not require more than one person. Just for your own benefit, you might sit down one day and take pencil and paper and write out an argument. If you're confused about something, it's a good exercise to figure out where you think things are, how they go. I think this is the case. I also think this is the case. What is the case because those two first things are the cases? And you don't have to have another person. Notice especially, letter B, that emotions and feelings or convictions are not components of an argument. That's because we don't discern whether an argument's conclusion is true on the basis of how we feel about it. Just as we do not discern whether both sides of an equation are equal by our feelings. And that's not to denigrate emotions, feelings, or convictions. In fact, the great value of those things is that they may move us to participate when we'd rather not, but should. Any perusal of the kinds of quarrels that happen on social media is enough to make many people lose heart and decide to cut out and remain uninvolved, when in fact that might be the mission field, right? And so the emotions can help move us toward the other. And we don't even have to stay with social media. Just in general, we're becoming more, because I think of internet and social media, reality in which we live, we're becoming more the kind of people that in general don't even want to have in-person conversations as frequently because of how combative they typically become. So our emotions can be positive in the sense that they stir in us the awareness that there is a need and that we ought to move forward rather than backward. Feelings likewise can alert us, just staying with this point for a moment longer, they can alert us in our conversations with people to the other person's temperament and maybe help us make wiser decisions about whether this is really the time for an argument or not. Not a quarrel, but whether it's time for the analysis of our ideas together, or whether there's a better time for it. So I'm not denigrating emotions, feelings, just to say that those things aren't integral components to an argument. And when they're allowed to become components in an argument, that's when things go south, because they're distracting. And we think that on the basis of the strength of our feelings, we should be taken seriously, when in fact that's not the case. So let's look at the constituent parts then of what's an argument. What really is an argument? How do you make one? I've used the word premise and I've used the word conclusion, so let's get clear on that. A premise is simply a statement or a proposition intended to provide support for a conclusion. And there are lots of kinds of statements. There are lots of kinds of sentences. And those are different, not necessarily the same thing as statements. A question, for example, can't be a premise. Right? A premise is a claim that something is the case. And a conclusion, then, is a statement or proposition intended to show what results from another proposition or propositions, often beginning, therefore, so like in the example above. All men are mortal is a statement, Socrates is a man, and the relationship between those two statements is followed by the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. I guess I don't have a therefore there, but one could put it in. It would go naturally there. And one's hope in constructing an argument is to show how the conclusion is a necessary result of the supporting premises, as in the example above. Socrates has to be mortal if he's a man, and it's also the case that all men are mortal. And that brings us to validity. Validity refers to the health of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. When the conclusion is a necessary result of the premises, has to be the case, we say that the conclusion follows from the premises and is therefore valid. Arguments whose conclusions do not follow from their premises are therefore invalid. So when you say to somebody, your conclusion is invalid, what's going to happen? They'll take offense, right? It's because we don't know what valid and invalid means. It's got nothing to do with the person. It's just about the relationship between the statements. You're not a worse person or a better person, whether you traffic in invalidity or validity. It's got nothing to do with you. It's all about the statements on the paper. So that's why it's very helpful, I think, to reduce emotional involvement in the analysis of ideas. It's just math, you can tell people. I see how far that goes, right? This is why we need education in logic. This is why we need to learn this stuff and to be able to teach it to others. So we have fewer personal conflicts and more productive conversations that lead to the truth together, to discovering the truth together. This is crucial. A couple of notes on validity. It refers only to the relationship between premises and their conclusion, and not to the individual truth or falsity either of an argument's premise or of its conclusion. The following argument is actually valid even though all of its premises and its conclusion are false. All dogs are birds. All birds are fish. Therefore, all dogs are fish. If it's true that all dogs are birds, and it's also true that all birds are fish, then the third line is also true, necessarily so, that all dogs are fish. If it's a dog, then it's also a bird from premise 1, and if it's a bird, then it's also a fish from premise 2. So validity just has to do with the relationship. That's a very valid question. I've heard it said many, many times, and maybe you have too. Maybe you've said that. When someone asks a good question, we want to affirm that person, and well, we should. But that's not the way to do it. That's a very valid question, represents a misunderstanding of validity in at least 2 ways. And in case you're dying in all this theory, I've got something for you. I just continue to harbor to you. I have 2 bags of coffee here, and one of them is yours, if you can fill in the blanks on your handout there. So that's a very valid question, represents a misunderstanding of validity in 2 ways. First of all, someone shouted out, validity is not... Well, that's true too. That's not what I had in mind, but I don't know if I can deny you the coffee. They're reading from 4.4, I think, which is cheating. So, and this is why it's also not the answer.
She wants the coffee.
Well, you might still get it. Take another crack at it. I'll give you a hint. Validity is not a matter of... I heard emotion. Did I hear fact? I think I'd have to let truth stand, but I don't remember who said it first. Was it over here? It was over here somewhere. Okay. Now we're going to have a fight in the aisles about who gets the coffee. I had in mind, and I realize I'm reaching for saying this is unfamiliar terrain, but validity is not a matter of degree. And I'll tell you why I think that. A conclusion is either valid or invalid in that it either does or does not result necessarily from the premises. So it can't be very valid or somewhat valid or almost valid. You know, if it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, it's either true or it isn't true that Socrates is mortal, right? Sorry, it either follows or doesn't follow that Socrates is mortal. So it's not a matter of truth, it's a matter of the relationship between the statements, and it's not a matter of degree. I think I'll let truth go, though. So I have 2 different kinds here. I have Guatemala and I have Caramel Crunch. You get to pick. I'm going to go ahead with Patrick. Caramel? Okay, I think, let's see here. That's this one right here. You're welcome to get it afterward. Okay, so there's one still up for grabs. This is the Guatemala. Very good. Questions, blank, blank, blank. What was this? I think you're right. What?
I said questions are very valid.
Questions are very valid?
Are not valid.
Are not valid, right. I'll accept that. Questions I have cannot be valid. Questions, questions are not valid is also true. If it's the case that questions cannot be valid, then it's true. It's also the case that questions are not valid. So, very nice. This is a category error. The idea that questions can be valid. Since only conclusions can be valid, questions cannot be the necessary result of anything. In a situation or a statement made by someone else, saying something that in some other person's mind raises a question doesn't mean you've elicited a valid question. You've just raised someone's curiosity. But because questions depend on curiosity, and curiosity cannot be a requirement, because not everybody will be curious, then they can't necessarily follow, right? So what we're learning here is to care more deeply about word care. And we're learning to differentiate in our minds between the component parts of the conversations we have with one another, and how to call things, like Adam did, by their name. So for the sake of clarity, which is an act of love, toward the person across from you. So, sisters, this is the Guatemala here. Don't confuse them. The caramel crunch has already been spoken for over here. Guatemala's on the left. Soundness. What about soundness? Someone was saying, reading ahead here. Validity is not to be confused with soundness. An argument might be valid, but unsound, as in the example above in 4:3 with the dogs and fish and birds business. In order for an argument to be sound, it must be valid. So it has to be valid. It's a condition. It's not the same thing. So its conclusion must follow from its premises, and each of its premises must be true. And when an argument is valid, and all of its premises are true, we say it is a sound argument, because it produces a conclusion that is necessarily true. It has to be the case. It can't be otherwise. And it should be accepted by any lover of the truth. And the worst thing, I suppose, for the prideful is to be shown a sound argument against the position. But back to Socrates and Gorgias and their conversation. That's a happy event for the lover of wisdom and truth, not one to be avoided. We should seek out those times when people can show us that we're in error. So it really does have to do with the disposition of the heart, but also of the requisite skills. Fallacies are the presence of a mistake in an argument, or the presence of a mistake in an argument which disqualifies the argument from being sound. And we traffic in fallacies and fallacious thinking. Here are a few of the more common ones. Begging the question doesn't mean identifying a question that comes naturally out of what someone has said. That begs the question, and then, no, it's a different thing altogether. Begging the question assumes the truth or falsity of a conclusion before an argument is considered. So in front of the argument, when I've already assumed, and I argue from this position of my assumption, I'm begging the question. Ad hominem is very common. The Latin for ad hominem, it's a Latin term meaning simply to or toward the man. It directs the attention of the conversation partners toward the person making the argument rather than to the argument itself and its soundness or unsoundness. Ad hominems essentially change the subject, don't they? We move from the analysis of statements to the person. You're making that argument because you think blah, blah, blah. Or that's only the sort of argument that someone would make if, right, they're directing attention away from the argument and toward the person who's making the argument. And that delays the happy task of coming together in the truth. It's a waste of time to do that. If that's happened to you, you don't need to be unsettled, because you'll realize that, that person actually isn't about the business of showing me where I'm mistaken, because they've left the topic. And a good friend, a good neighbor, will redirect the conversation back to the argument itself, so that we can get back to the business of coming together in the truth, which is the goal. The tu quoque, very common. I'm sorry I didn't define it there. I was scooting through the notes and I realized I didn't elaborate. Tu quoque is more Latin. It just means you too. And I'm guilty of thinking this anyway, and maybe you have been too, when you hear an accusation from someone and you say, well, you do it too. And that might be true, that the other person does it too, but that doesn't render it false that you do it. And so in that moment that Socrates models for us, when it's time to avail ourselves to the correction of others, and the inclination emotionally is to retort, well, you do this too, hold the reins and realize that that doesn't render it false, what that person has identified in you. I didn't get false dilemma up there, or false dichotomy, and I have examples, but I'm running out of time. Quick on sophistry, the use of clever but fallacious arguments in order to persuade or disparage. This is how I would categorize most of the talk I see on the internet. It's being clever, turning phrases, making jokes in order to poison the well, so to speak. of the listeners and get somebody to gang up and agree with me against somebody else. Those are very difficult moments to navigate. That happens in person as well. Anybody who's been to junior high remembers this. Moving forward, I mentioned this already, that really all of these word identifications and concept identifications are an urging on my part to do, I think, as Paul is admonishing us to do, ultimately, is just to care more about word care. Caring about word care is caring for my neighbor. It's doing what Josh was exhorting us to do from James 3. And what the examples in Proverbs and elsewhere that Dad read at the first session. So here are a couple of, again, very practical suggestions on my part. Avoid, in the course of your exchanges, avoid statements about oneself, about yourself. A statement that begins, well, I think, is a form of personal testimony, which is a species of the ad hominem fallacy, except instead of leaving the argument to turn your talk toward your conversation partner, you're going the other direction. You're directing the attention toward yourself. But the question is not what you think. The question is about whether each statement in the argument is true or false, and whether the relationship between them yields the conclusion that's been proposed. It's just math. Likewise, avoid statements about your dialogue partner for the same reason. Such statements change the subject and waste time and energy and emotion. They more often than not are received as unwanted attention, or as a personal attack, which is most likely, drawing attention away from the only place the truth of a matter may be discovered, which is in the argument's statements itself. I have a couple other points, but maybe let's switch over to the appendix and just identify a few things here. This is an appendix that I found on a blog called Principium Unitatis. Actually, Brian Cross is the author of that blog too. I've learned a great deal from him. I've adapted these things here, changed some wordings there, added some things. We won't go down through the entire thing, but I hope I submit it to you as a resource, maybe something you could consult. I think you'll find some familiar items in here. But I want to read that paragraph. It's the most important paragraph as we get toward our conclusion right before lunch here. So as we've been reviewing, an argument is composed of premises and a conclusion. And a sound argument is one in which the conclusion follows from premises that are true. And if that's the case, then the conclusion is true, and the lover of wisdom will accept the conclusion, whether it's unsettling or not. So there are essentially three possible proper responses to a deductive argument, a sound argument. To a deductive argument, where there are premises and a conclusion. Either we show the argument to be unsound, or we accept the truth of its conclusion, or we withhold judgment for the time being, explaining that we need time to think about it or investigate it more deeply. And then we take the time to think about it until we can either show the argument to be unsound, refute it, or we accept the truth of its conclusion. We do not change the subject or criticize the person presenting the argument or talk about ourselves. Arguments are not properly evaluated by self-referring statements such as, "I don't buy that argument," or "I'm unpersuaded," or "I'm skeptical," or "I am..." The question at hand is not about oneself, but about whether the argument is sound. So talking about oneself is changing the subject and avoiding the question at hand. The only two ways to refute an argument are to show that one or more of the premises are false, or show that the conclusion does not follow from the premises, that the relationship is unhealthy, right? This doesn't match that. That's why none of the following statements refutes an argument. And if you've said these, you're not alone. I have too. But you've probably heard them. Things like, "That argument doesn't work." Or, "That argument is unhelpful. It's vinegar and soda," That might be right. It might be an unwise time to make this argument, like vinegar and soda from Proverbs 25:20 we read earlier. It might just erupt. And maybe that's true, but that doesn't show that the argument is unsound, or that the conclusion shouldn't be accepted. That argument is absurd, old, tired, tiresome, stale, impossible. Argument's impossible, and so on. One does not show that an argument is unsound, nor that its conclusion is false, by complaining about it or by insulting it. Certainly not by insulting the person making the argument. So I think just getting clarity about just exactly what an argument is and how to make one and how to analyze one are tremendously helpful in doing what St. Paul urges us to do. This is what we're going to need to learn, at least at a basic level, so that we can be making the most use of our time, so that we'll know how to answer each person. We can skip most of the rest, I think. Maybe very briefly, just look at a couple here. Number 10 is worth noting. An assertion, something is the case, is not an argument, although it's often taken to be. It's merely an assertion. By itself, stating something or claiming something does not establish the truth of what it claims. This is often misunderstood. Many people think that just by claiming it or pounding the table harder, I will establish the truth of what I'm saying, and you'll agree with me. And it might be the case that you're inclined to agree with the person who does that, but it's not that the claim has been shown to be true. You need an argument to do that, and only an argument can. I think we can maybe skip most of the rest, although I leave it for your benefit. Maybe a final parting comment, though. In all these things, if this is a little technical or tedious, the idea is that there is a skill set out there that benefits Christians to have or to develop if we're going to carry out our mission well, to learn how to respond in truth and wisdom and love to those who are on the opposite side of something from us. And many people don't realize that it is a skill set, that it's a science. And just as reading Scripture carefully requires certain tools to be in the toolbox. And there are places you can go to get those tools. And one should do that as one is able to do that in order to be a more careful reader of Scripture. So also, one should go get those tools to put in one's toolbox in order to be a more productive participant in conversations in which we disagree or in which we see things differently. I hope it was helpful and a little different presentation for me. I'm going to invite my father back up to make a few announcements before we break for lunch. And again, we'll be happy to field questions and have conversations with you during or after lunch, I think. So thanks for your patience.